Wine threw herself on the bed. She was sobbing massively. She sat on the bed and ran her hand through her hair. She screamed in frustration. Junko let out a sigh before resting his back on the chair. He frowned as he heard a scream coming out of Vian's room. He rushed to her room and knocked on the door softly. Junko said calmly to make her feel better. Vian took her anger out of him, making him more worried about her. She yelled. Vian panicked and her eyes landed on a sharp knife. He begged, but she was in her thoughts. Junko's eyes popped out in shock. He started hitting the door with his shoulder. Vine took a knife and placed it on her wrist, ready to cut. She sat and closed her eyes, tears falling down as they were at the edge of her eyes. Junko broke the door and rushed to her. He quickly grabbed the knife and threw it away from her. He yelled at her, but his eyes turned soft as she fell down. Junko placed her head on his lap, gently patted her cheeks to wake her up. Her body was lying on the floor unconsciously. Junko carried her into his arm and took her into his room. Jungkook nodded at doctor as his eyes were fixed on Vian, who was still unconscious. He followed the doctor to the gate and let out a sigh as doctor left. Jungkook started towards his room but stopped when his eyes landed on a piece of paper. He took the paper on the floor and checked it. Jungkook frowned after reading Mr. Jun's name on it. He didn't know that. Jungkook's eyes turned soft as he saw her sleeping figure while hugging his pillow. He shook his head and sat on the edge of the bed next to her. Jungkook caresses Vian's hair gently. A small smile curved on his lip on the thought of their memories. Jungkook moved her hair behind her ear. He sighed and went to other side to sleep. He whispered and laid on the bed. Jungkook woke up when he felt something heavy on his chest. He groaned and opened his eyes slowly. Jungkook chuckled, seeing his wife snuggling into his chest. He caresses her back, giving her warmth. Vine clutched his waist and hid herself in him. He whispered in a deep husky voice, causing her heart to skip a bit. She immediately stood up. Junko pulled her back to him and placed her head on his chest again. Junko cleared her mind, causing her to think about something else. He teased her, making her sigh. She said coldly, Vian's heart beat fast. She whispered in shock. She got out of his grip and left the room. Jungkook got up and went to get fresh. After getting fresh, Jungkook and Vian both met each other in the dining area. There was an awkward silence between them. No one dared to utter a word. Jungkook stealing glance from time to time at Vian if she was eating or not. She choked on food because of his sudden voice. Jungkook rushed to her, gave her a glass of water, and patted her back until she caught her breath. Vian nodded and he went back to his seat. Vian asked, while focusing on her food, he asked with a smile on his face. Vian coldly asked. She let out a sigh and thought for some time before nodding her head in agreement. He smiled brightly and continued his breakfast. Chanko stopped the car in front of his company. Vian got off the car and made her way to entrance. The guard stopped her because he had never seen her here before. She glanced at him confused. He demanded and Vian smiled and shook her head. Junko came to them and guards saluted him. They nodded and opened the door. Junko entered the company along with his wife. Her beauty amazed everyone. Junko was a little pissed off because of male workers' guests on at his wife. He caught their attention. He smirked at satisfaction as everyone bowed to them. Junko held Vian's hand and intertwined his finger into hers. She was staring at him confusedly. Junko took her into his cabin and made her sit on the couch. She blinked her eyes multiple times and nodded. Junko caressed her cheeks and left. Sobin's car stopped in front of the monumental building. He got out of the car and made his way to the entrance. Everyone bowed to him as he walked by them. One assistant was holding an iPad, another one with a file, walking along with him into the company. Vine was sitting beside Jungkook in the meeting hall. Their gaze shifted on the door, which was revealing Choi Sobin. Vine whispered under her breath. Sobin smirked as his gaze shifted to Vian. Jungkook clenched his jaw and glanced at Vian, who was in shock. He whispered into her ear. Vian nodded and looked away from Sobin. Mr. Jun said, while smiling slightly. Everyone stood up and bowed to him. Vian smiled at him and took her seat back. After an hour, as the meeting was over, everyone stepped out of the hall. Vian took her file and was about to go out but stopped by Mr. Jun. Sobin shook his head and smiled. Mr. Jun looked at him confusedly. Mr. Jun nodded and went out. His lips were plastered with a creepy smirk. Jungkook stooped and was about to grab his collar but stopped as Ryan said. She said coldly and left them. Sobin asked but got no answer. Jungkook followed Ryan. She sighed as she cleared the room. Sobin smiled at her and glanced at Jungkook coldly. Jungkook shooted him a dead glare. Jungkook gazed turned into dark. He didn't like the way Sobin was smiling at her, trying to get her attention. They signed the agreement one by one while glaring at each other. They nodded and she left them for a while. Jungkook threw a question, Sobin said mockingly. Sobin raised his eyebrows at Jungkook. Jungkook gritted his teeth and immediately sat in his seat as Ryan entered. They both smiled and looked at Ryan. They nodded and Ryan went to the couch and sat. She started reading and checking the file. Sobin stated. Jungkook smirked and rolled his eyes. His smirk widened as he saw Sobin's emotionless face. Sobin tightened his grip on the pen and looked away. Sobin glanced at Ryan. Jungkook yelled, causing them to flinch. Ryan gaze shifted towards Jungkook. He smiled awkwardly and sat back in his chair. Ryan shook her head and continued her work. Sobin smirked. After a long day, Ryan stretched her body and glanced at the time. It was lunchtime, and her stomach growled. Jungkook pressed his lips to control his laugh. While Sobin entered the office with a tray of food, Jungkook looked at him and rolled his eyes. He mentally cursed himself and let out a sigh. Sobin sat beside Ryan and placed a tray of food on the table. Ryan sat and was about to go, but stopped by Sobin when he held her wrist. He said calmly, causing her eyes to tear up. She smiled and sat back on the couch and started to eat. Sobin chuckled and patted her head. She said to him coldly and continued eating. Jungkook smiled brightly and joined them.